world of Castlevania is clearly fictional, but many of its characters are based on real people. Bram Stoker and Konami both took the name of the Prince of Wallachia, Dracula, aka Vlad the Impaler. Vlad was born in Transylvania, the central region of Romania, and had his own digs called Poinar Castle. Its location near the northeast forests of the Carpathian Mountains inspired the book, films, and games. Villains and heroes, both fictional and historical, have entered Castlevania, so to know its history of spoofs and tributes is to understand both sides. Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian countess rumored to have tortured and killed hundreds of young women. Elizabeth Bartley, her alter ego, was executed for vampirism in the early 1600s, which would line up perfectly with Bathory's death in 1614. Gilles de Rais was a Breton knight, not to mention a compatriot of Joan of Arc, a powerful military tactician, and a schizophrenic madman whose exploits named him as a vicious werewolf. Bram Stoker himself included an acknowledgement to Sheridan Le Fanu, the creator of Carmilla Karnstein, in his foreword to Dracula. Dagon was a version of one of H.P. Lovecraft's Old Ones. The Comte de Saint-Germain of Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough's series of novels that began in the late 1970s echoed the foppish boss in Curse of Darkness. And although the Golem is a facet of Hebrew mythology, it was Gustav Meyrink novel in 1914 that mirrored Shelley's horrific themes in Frankenstein. Mythology filled in the gaps, the majority of which was Greek, inspiring Minotaurs, Chimera, Manticores, the three-headed guardian of the underworld Cerberus, and the Gorgon queen Medusa. Balkan myth inspired the Rusalka in Order of Ecclesia, and Celtic myth produced the Balor. Biblical and Hebrew mythology brought Abaddon and Beelzebub to the castle, and ancient Assyrian and Babylonian gods made an appearance in the forms of Adramelech and Pazuzu. This is where the truth ends and Konami's fiction begins. In 2002, preceding the release of Harmony of Dissonance, Konami posted a timeline on the GBA Games official website. Fans noticed several events were intentionally cut, including Legends, Circle of the Moon, Legacy of Darkness, and Castlevania 64. 3 years later, Konami accepted a few back into the Castlevania Extreme Desktop timeline, and in 2006, bonus material with Portrait of Ruin added all the titles officially, except for Legends. While there is heavy contention as to which order of events is correct, all the games were given a year or era, so stacking them isn't the issue. The difficult part comes in figuring out the complete list Konami actually intended. 17 games make up the core history of Castlevania, a tale that's been reset by the latest release, Lords of Shadow. As that era begins, the time has come to put this one to rest. According to lore, the first Belmont to begin the crusade was Leon. Leon entered the Forest of Eternal Night to recover his love Sarah and investigate waves of monsters spilling out of the area. In the castle of Walter Bernhard, Leon endured his burden, unlocked the potential of a powerful family heirloom known as the Vampire Killer, and had a part in the transformation of his friend Matthias Kronqvist into the infamous Undead Lord. With the help of Death, Matthias used the ebony and crimson stones to exact revenge against God after his wife Elisabetha was taken from him. Although Leon defeated Death and vowed to hunt Dracula, the two never actually fought each other.
Mother!
That voice! Alucard, it's you!
Dracula married a second time to a woman named Lisa, but she would be convicted of witchcraft and burned at the stake sometime in the 15th century. Konami sets the date as 1470, but this contrasts Alucard's age, suggested in Symphony of the Night. His non-canonical appearance in Legends puts Alucard's mother's death somewhere around the early 1400s, which most fans believe.
Alucard, you incompetent idiot! Out of my castle, you deadbeat!
Hey! You can't kick me out! I'll show you! You just wait and see!
The first Belmont to defeat the Prince of Darkness was Trevor. Despite rumors of the family's supernatural powers, Trevor was the first to actually reclaim the Vampire Killer. His journey began in 1476, the same year Dracula's real-life inspiration, Vlad Tepes, died. It is unclear as to whether or not Matthias Kronqvist was intended to correlate with the actual Wallachian nobleman. Trevor's story continued 3 years later in Curse of Darkness. The hero Hector's friend, Isaac, was used as a host for Dracula's spirit. Hector destroyed Death, Dracula, and his blight put upon the world. After Trevor's experiences in the castle, he settled down with companion Sifa Belnades and became the patron of both the Belmont and Belnades clans. Trevor's Japanese counterpart, Ralph Belmondo, clearly suffered the most variance in translation from Japanese to English, but his wife Sifa and her offspring would also share multiple identities. According to lore, Sifa was a female who had to disguise her gender in order to become a vampire hunter. However, due to a mistake in the original English manual for Dracula's curse, Sifa was listed as male. This lasted for the early part of her Western career, which even led to a brief cameo in Captain N the Game Master as the incorrect gender. In the English version of Dracula's Curse, as well as subsequent games featuring the character's last name, Sifa's heritage was as a Belnades. However, according to the Japanese versions of the game, as well as Castlevania 64, the name is pronounced closer to Fernandez. Sifa's actual last name was intended to mimic a Romanian surname that neither Japanese nor English could articulate, and as a result, was lost in translation. This type of misnomer can also be seen with Sifa's adventuring companion, Grant Dynasty, who most logically intended to be named after the dynasty, one of the two main lineages of Wallachia nobility. After Trevor, the Count seemed to return every century, barring the meddling of toadies like Shaft, Barlow, and Camilla. Christopher was described as being Trevor's successor, and was likely his grandson based on the passage of time. Christopher's adventure took place in 1576, exactly 100 years after Dracula's curse. Order of Shadows and Resurrection, both considered outside the timeline, would take place decades later. Over a century passed when Christopher's descendant, Simon, stormed through the gates. Again, it's unclear as to Christopher's relation to Simon, although it's assumed that he was Simon's grandfather. It's also unclear as to whether Soleil, Christopher's son, was Simon's father or uncle. Simon Belmont, or Shimon Belmondo to the Japanese, had his exploits captured in Castlevania 1, 4, Chronicles, and Haunted Castle. Simon began his quest in 1691 and finally destroyed Dracula for a second time in 1698, leading up to the turn of the 18th century. The Count became more resilient following his defeat to Simon, returning from the dead to battle the Belmont every 50 or so years. The next Belmont to take up the vampire killer was Simon's grandson, Just. He was chosen to carry the heirloom in 1476 and engaged Castlevania 2 years later. Just's quest was probably the least heroic, as he was the first Belmont to almost accidentally encounter Dracula. Just's actual goal in Harmony of Dissonance was to rescue Liddy. Dracula just got in the way. While Just was actually documented as being Simon's grandson, the series returned to family ambiguity with his descendant, Richter. It is again assumed that Richter is Just's grandson, as this seemed to be the reoccurring theme. Richter's substantial stint in lore began in 1792, just under 50 years after Just. His first trial would be to rescue his girlfriend, Annette, along with Tara, Iris, and Maria. Richter and Maria were intended to come back 2 years later for the bloodletting, but instead reunited in 1797, when Richter's mind was captured and Alucard came knocking. In 2008, a radio drama was released giving the duo one last thrill that took place 1 year later. Richter would be the last Belmont to take up the vampire killer for a long time. For the next 200 years, the world would go without the Belmonts. For some reason, the house went into hibernation, leaving the slaying to family friends, the Morrises, who also had a personal grudge against the Count. Various secret societies also began to form, including the Order of Ecclesia. When Albus stole the glyphs in memory of Shinoa, he was actually preventing her sacrifice to Dominus, and ended up taking her place as she used it on Count Dracula. Betrayed by her master Barlow, Shinoa was left without a friend or a teacher. Morris Baldwin would carry the weight of Dracula's suppression after the order, and with the parents of Nathan Graves, he sealed Dracula away in 1820. Ever the vigilant undead, Dracula was resurrected by Chaos worshippers a decade later, forcing Morris's students to join the ongoing struggle. Like Albus, Hugh appeared the betrayer, but Nathan was able to save both student and master. "24 years later, while Nathan and Hugh were still conceivably alive, Dracula's slaves burned nearby villages and snatched up children including Ada, sister to the werewolf Cornell. Dracula teased the warrior's nemesis, Ortega, with the gift of greater power. Despite both enemies being destroyed by Cornell, Dracula re-emerged 8 years later. Reinhard Schneider and Carrie Fernandez first mistook the vampire Gilles de Rais for the castle's lord, but a young violin player named Malice turned out to be Dracula reborn. Dracula was published in May of 1897, and the actions of Jonathan Harker and Quincy Morris were added to the Castlevania legend to support the inclusion of Quincy's son, John. John crossed over most of Europe with his childhood friend Eric Lecard in 1914, avenging his fallen father and helping Eric find peace after the Countess Bartley made Eric's wife a vampire. But Eric's tragedy was just beginning, and 30 years later his daughters would be taken as well. Bloodline suggested the Countess was responsible for starting World War I, and Portrait of Ruin began with Dracula being trapped inside his own castle by Count Bronner as the world around him recovered from World War II. Jonathan Morris regretted not being able to stop Dracula with the vampire killer, but his father kept the knowledge from Jonathan to save him from being corrupted. Together with childhood friend Charlotte Allen, Jonathan stopped Dracula cold. Eric's daughters were returned to him in the good ending, and the Lanceman's spirit was set free. One last Belmont would questionably resurface towards the end of the 20th century. In the Suite of Sorrow, Julius was referred to as having defeated Dracula in a clash known as the Demon Castle War, which is yet to be realized in playable form. In the events of Aria of Sorrow, Julius recovered from amnesia caused by this fateful fight, and continued to challenge the Dark Lord by helping Soma Cruz suppress his powers. The last time Dracula was actually defeated in battle was by Julius Belmont in 1999. The next spawn of Dracula's soul was Soma Cruz, who discovered his powers and will be transported to Castlevania 25 years from now. Two cults would challenge Soma in 2 years, the first sparked by Graham Jones, and the second by Celia Fortner and her puppets Dimitri and Dario. With the help of his friends and the long-secluded Alucard pretending to be Genya Arikado, Soma was able to control his darker side despite these dual threats. Soma and Julius were able to part ways without destroying each other. This would be the end of the timeline if it weren't for 2009's Castlevania Judgment.
If you will fight, then stand resolute.
Set thousands of years in the future, the Time Watcher Aeon assembled 13 warriors to overcome the time-altering Garamoth and his messenger, the Time Reaper. Although it is considered canon, most of the events pertain to Judgment alone, despite including fighters from multiple eras. Some of the characters in Judgment might have met gamers in 2009 for the first time, given how long the series has survived and how many consoles it's corrupted over the years. As Slayers live and die, one of the only threads to tie the franchise together is the music. An astonishing 30 composers have worked on the series in its 24-year lifespan. Several tracks have appeared multiple times, and most players that know them by heart probably don't know what they're called. Vampire Killer was written for Castlevania 1. Bloody Tears for Simon's Quest. The Beginning for Dracula's Curse. Simon's Theme for Castlevania 4. and Bloodlines for Rondo of Blood. Even a remix of Alucard's theme from Symphony could be heard by putting the disc in a CD player, and multiple soundtrack collections have chronicled the collective work. A tribute concert dedicated entirely to the Castlevania series was held in Stockholm, Sweden on February 19, 2010. The concert was initiated by pianist David Westerlund and featured a guest performance by Michiru Yamane. There were virtually no orchestral arrangements written for these games, so many had to be created from scratch. More than 2 decades after the rusted gates of Castlevania first opened, the series fought for immortality by appearing in multiple mediums. In 2009, its evil invaded Paki-slot gambling machines in Japan only, then returned for a sequel this year. This past summer, fans could try Castlevania Puzzle Encore of the Night for the iPhone, which followed Puzzle Quest and Puzzle Fighter's approach with Dracula's own custom Gothic design. Along with many classic titles released digitally, a new multiplayer experience launched on Xbox Live Arcade in August, called Harmony of Despair. That unified the lineage of Slayers in sprite form online, similar to their assembly in Judgment. And of course, Lords of Shadow raised questions as to whether we'll ever see more of the series as it was. Will this new bloodline last as long as the first? The Castlevania series has only existed for a quarter of a century, but the timeline covers just under 1,000 years. Some have criticized that, like its blood-sucking antagonist, Castlevania would expire if it didn't feed off others. They point to elements borrowed from Metroid, Devil May Cry, and God of War. But no matter the protagonist or the perspective, there's something unmistakable about flogging the marching undead with the Morning Star while leaping across crumbling platforms suspended over a bed of spikes. It's rare that a video game character transcends its film counterpart, but that's exactly what Konami has done. Dracula can challenge Bowser for the most interactive appearances by the same villain, and it's that consistency that keeps loyal hunters leaping, falling, restarting, and eventually conquering evil. For its faithful and determined followers, Castlevania will always stand for meticulous atmosphere, stunning art design, unforgiving boss encounters, and one hell of a fun challenge.